They told us paper was just for writing. They didn't tell us it was for building. Welcome back to the archives of the pivot paper. I've got a story for you today about a woman who had to redraw her own map. Sit with me for a moment. Listen to the house. It's 2015. Outside, the world was moving toward the cloud, but inside the corner offices of Midtown, the walls were still made of heavy oak and unspoken rules. Simone was a woman who lived by those rules. For 22 years, she arrived before the sun and left long after it had surrendered to the skyline. She wore her authority like a well-tailored suit, sharp, expensive, and restrictive. She was the senior vice president of strategy. She was the one who fixed the broken things. She was the one who kept the secrets. But in 2015, the firm decided it was time for a new direction. They called it a voluntary separation, a golden handshake. They presented it to her in a room that smelled of expensive beeswax and cold ambition. They told her she was a legend. They told her she had earned her rest. And then they slid a folder across the table. Simone felt the weight of that folder before she even opened it. It was heavy, institutional. She took it home to her study, kicked off her black leather pumps, and let them lie where they fell on the rug. The blue light of her laptop was the only witness to her reckoning. She poured a glass of water, the ice clinking against the crystal, a lonely sound in a house she had paid for but rarely lived in. She began to read the fine print. She wasn't just being offered a graceful exit, she was being offered a cage. You see, Simone's brilliance wasn't just in her title, it was in the way she could look at a failing supply chain and see the heartbeat of a company. It was in her Rolodex, a digital and mental archive of every power player from New York to Johannesburg. But tucked into paragraph 12, subsection C, was the erasure, a non-compete clause she had signed in 2005, updated in 2012, and now being weaponized in 2015. It didn't just say she couldn't work for a competitor, it said she couldn't exist in her own industry for 3 years. 3 years is an eternity for a woman in her 50s. They weren't just paying her to leave, they were paying her to disappear, to take everything she had built, her intellectual property, her network, her very name, and lock it in their vault. She realized then that for 20 years she had been a builder, but she had been building on land she didn't own. She was about to walk away with a check, yes, but she was also about to walk away without her hands. She didn't know yet that there was a hidden door in the architecture of that contract. She didn't know that the very cloud the world was obsessed with in 2015 was about to become her greatest leverage. She sat there in the blue light, realizing that her golden handshake was actually a set of silver handcuffs. And the key wasn't in the money they were offering. The key was in a different kind of paper, a paper she hadn't written yet. In our community, we are taught to be the first in the office, the last to leave, the most dependable. We are taught that the work is the asset, but Simone was learning the hard way that the work is just the labor, the paper is the asset. And if you don't own the paper that governs your brain, you don't own your life. She looked at her discarded shoes and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was a high-level executive with a mid-level sovereignty, and she had exactly 48 hours to decide if she was going to sign her own erasure or if she was going to become an architect. To be continued. In part 2, we look at the moment Simone stopped reading and started redrawing. Simone stayed in that chair until the blue light of the laptop was swallowed by the gray mist of a Tuesday morning. She realized that the firm wasn't just offering her a retirement, they were offering her an expiration date. They wanted her to sit on a porch in Sag Harbor and let her brilliance atrophy while they harvested the seeds she had planted over 2 decades. It wasn't a handshake, it was a heist. She reached out and touched the edge of the mahogany desk. The wood felt cold, unyielding, like the men who had sat across from her just hours before. They expected her to be grateful for the numbers on the page, but Simone knew that numbers without structure are just ghosts. They vanish when the wind changes. She didn't call her lawyer first, she called her spirit. And then she opened a fresh ledger, not a digital one, but a heavy cloth-bound book she had kept in the back of her drawer. In 2015, the world was rushing toward the ephemeral, but Simone knew that power is always found in the tactile, in the paper trail. She began what I call a forensic reconstruction of her own value. She didn't list her duties, she listed her authority. Every deal she had brokered, every proprietary process she had engineered, every relationship that lived in her phone and not in their CRM. She realized that the non-compete clause was broad because they were afraid. They weren't protecting the firm, they were trying to contain a force of nature. She picked up a heavy silver stylus and began to draw a line down the center of the page. On the left, the corporate employee. On the right, the sovereign entity. The condensation from her glass of water had left a ring on the wood, a temporary mark that would soon vanish. She decided then that she would no longer be a temporary mark in their ledger. She was going to move from income to assets. She saw the opening in paragraph 14, a small, poorly drafted clause regarding pre-existing intellectual property. They had forgotten the white papers she had written before she ever walked through their glass doors. They had forgotten that the foundation was hers. But a realization is not a victory. A realization without a technical mechanism is just a well-dressed grievance. Simone knew she couldn't just say no to the contract. She had to offer them a different architecture, one where they felt safe, but she remained free. She was about to move the pieces on a board they didn't even know she was playing on. In the quiet of that study, the architect began to speak. The strategy was simple, but the execution would be surgical. She wouldn't take the severance as a lump sum, a taxable event that would bleed 40% to the government before it even touched her hand. No, she would negotiate a consulting transition. She would form an LLC, not named after her, but named after a legacy. She would instruct them to pay her severance as a consulting retainer over 24 months into her new firm. And then she would use the most powerful quiet tool in the 2015 arsenal, the solo 401k. This would allow her to shelter massive amounts of that severance from taxes, turning their exit pay into her capital engine. But the real pivot, the one that would make them sweat, was the non-compete. She wouldn't ask them to scrap it. She would offer to narrow it, to only cover the specific clients she had touched in the last 12 months. In exchange, she would give them advisory access for 2 years. Do you see the chess move? By becoming a consultant instead of a departed employee, she was changing her status within it. She was moving from a line item on their payroll to a vendor on their balance sheet. A vendor has rights. A vendor has intellectual property. A vendor can work with others. She felt the weight of the silver stylus in her hand. It felt like a scepter. She wasn't just saving her career, she was reclaiming the deed to her own mind. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 4 a.m. The house was still dark, but Simone was finally seeing clearly. She had been a guest in their house for 20 years, bringing her own furniture and painting their walls with her genius. It was time to pack her things and take the walls with her. But the firm wasn't going to let their star player walk away with the playbook so easily. To be continued. In part 3, the lawyers arrive, the masks come off, and we see what happens when old money meets new sovereignty. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was a vacuum of silence. In 2015, these rooms were still built to intimidate, all cold glass and steel, intended to make a person feel small against the weight of the institution. Simone sat at the center of the long table, her spine a straight line of ancestral defiance. Across from her sat the keepers of the status quo, 3 men in charcoal suits who believed they were there to witness a surrender. They had their standard severance agreement ready, a document designed to buy her silence and bury her career. But Simone didn't come to sign a surrender. She came to perform an exorcism. She placed a heavy brass-capped fountain pen on the table, the weight of it sounding like a gavel. She wasn't Simone the employee anymore. She was Simone, the managing member of the Heritage Ledger, LLC. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice rhythmic and slow, "we are not here to discuss my departure. We are here to discuss our new partnership." She watched the confusion ripple across their faces, a brief crack in the corporate mask. She explained that she would not be accepting their golden handshake as a private citizen. She was rejecting the individual payout in favor of a B2B consulting contract between their firm and her new entity. Then came the reckoning, the moment she addressed paragraph 12. She didn't ask them to remove the non-commit. She offered to sharpen it until it worked in her favor. She narrowed the scope of competition to 3 specific firms she had no intention of joining. In exchange, she granted them a right of first refusal for her consulting hours for the next 24 months. To them, it looked like they were keeping her close. To Simone, it was the key to the kingdom. It effectively nullified their ability to stop her from building her own advisory firm. She was no longer restricted, she was retained. But the true genius of her move wasn't in the contract itself, it was in where the money was going to land. They thought they were paying a consultant. They didn't realize they were funding a dynasty. The asset architect knows that wealth is not what you make, it is what you keep. By restructuring her severance into a consulting retainer, Simone opened the door to the solo 401k. In 2015, this was the ultimate liquidity shield for the high-earning woman. She could now contribute up to $53,000 a year into her own retirement vehicle, nearly 10 times the limit of a standard IRA. She was taking corporate dollars, passing them through her LLC, and shielding them from the taxman's reach. She was turning their exit money into seed capital for her family's future. She reached out and touched the thick, cream-colored paper of the new agreement. It felt like stone. It felt like a foundation. This was the transfer of authority. She wasn't just moving money, she was moving the paper trail of her life from their file cabinets to her own vault. She was reclaiming her data, her contacts, and her intellectual property. She looked at the men across the table and saw them for what they were, temporary stewards of a power they didn't fully understand. She signed the document with a deliberate flowing stroke. The scratching of the nib on the heavy paper was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a woman redrawing the map of her own sovereignty. As she stood to leave, she didn't thank them for the opportunity, she thanked them for the clarity. She walked out of that glass tower not as a retired executive, but as a liberated architect. But the bridge between freedom and legacy is a narrow one, and Simone had one final move to make to ensure the bridge would hold for those coming after her. To be continued. In Part 4, the sun sets on the corporate skyline and rises on the family estate. We see the final legacy and the moment Simone hands the pen to the next generation. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the city in shades of copper and charcoal. Simone sat in her sanctuary, the private library she had built with the very brilliance they tried to buy. The air smelled of beeswax and old paper, the kind of stillness that only comes when the battles are won. On her desk sat the final document, the one that formalized her transition from the employee to the entity. She wasn't looking at the dollar amount on the check. She was looking at the name on the ledger, the Heritage Ledger, LLC. She realized then that her corporate divorce was actually her wedding to sovereignty. The solo 401k was no longer just a tax strategy in her mind. It was a fortress, a way to ensure that the harvest of her 22 years stayed within her own fences. By 2015, the world was obsessed with the noise of disruption, but Simone was focused on continuity. She had taken the momentum of a high-level career and funneled it into a vessel she owned. She was no longer trading her hours for their permission to exist in the industry. She reached for her teacup, the porcelain warm and solid against her palm. The steam rose in a slow, elegant curl toward the ceiling, mirroring the quiet peace in her chest. In the hall, she heard the light, quick footsteps of her daughter, a young woman just beginning her own climb. Simone didn't tell her about the coldness of the boardroom and the charcoal suits. She didn't speak of the fear that had gripped her in the blue light of the laptop. Instead, she invited her into the study and laid the paper flat on the mahogany desk. "This," Simone said, her voice a rhythmic, soulful anchor, "is how you own your mind." She taught her daughter that a job is a temporary assignment, but a contract is a permanent border. She showed her how the consulting retainer wasn't just money, it was the purchase of her own time. The true legacy was not the $53,000 she had sheltered from the taxman that year. The true legacy was the paper trail of a woman who refused to be a ghost in her own narrative. She had created a map that her daughter could follow, a map where the destination was always sovereignty. We are often told that our value is in our loyalty, but the architect knows that loyalty is a debt while ownership is an asset. Simone had successfully moved her genius from their operating expenses to her family balance sheet. The grandfather clock in the hall struck the hour, its heavy chime vibrating through the floorboards. Simone felt the weight of her fountain pen one last time before placing it in its velvet-lined tray. She wasn't just a retired executive, she was a sovereign strategist. The archives of 2015 would remember this as the year the pivot became the foundation. She had redrawn her map, not with a compass, but with a contract, and now the land she stood on was finally her own. It's time to stop being a guest in your own life and start being the architect. Sign your own pivot. Subscribe to the paper. Legacy is not what we leave behind. It is what we put in place. You have heard the story. You have seen the pivot. Now the drafting table is yours. If you are ready to move from equitable interest to legal sovereignty, join us in the vault. Secure the paper, protect the lineage. I am the asset architect, and this is the pivot paper.